Okay, so Boker Tov and Shavua Tov. Uh, our shiur this morning, as the rest of the series, dedicated Leilui Nishmat Rafael Moshe ben Eliyahu. Today, we speak about a very interesting person. This is Rabbi David Eliyahu Rabinowitz Teomim. Many names. We'll explain some of them. And you know, some of the people that we speak here about in this series of shiurim, some of them are interesting because of the sefarim they wrote, the books they wrote, and I try to encourage you to read or at least to look for some of them. Some are interesting because of the historical role they played in the development of Torah Sheba'al Peh, of Hashkafa. Some had a very important political role. And Rav Rabinowitz Teomim is also all of the above, but he's also a very interesting person in the sense that he's one of the very few rabbis that kept a personal diary, which we have here. That's his personal diary that was published in a few editions. Unfortunately, that is the censored edition. There is also the uncensored edition, but in the library, I was only able to get the censored one. And that gives us a window into the life and mind, the personal and private life and mind of a Gadol b'Israel, which is also always so interesting to see what is going on inside and not only the external stories. Now, the Aderet, a part of being a great Talmid Chacham, a very original genius. And also he was almost the Rav Rashi, as you would speak in a few minutes, almost the Rav Rashi of Yerushalayim and the whole of Eretz Israel. He also was the father-in-law of Rav Kook, Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook. And Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook wrote a whole, you can call it a hesped. It's not a biography. I don't think that he himself would have seen it as a biography, but it is a type of a very long hesped that he published as a small book. He called it Eder Hayakar. Why? Because Eder, Aleph, Daled, Reish, is acronym for Rashi Tevot for Eliyahu, David, Rabinowitz. So Eder Hayakar, Dear Eder, and in it is trying to marry the life of his father-in-law with the events and the ideologies and the illness, but also what Rav Kook sees as the solutions of the generation, which is a very, very complicated generation. It's an upheaval of Zionism, of Haskalah, enlightenment, of atheism, many, many things that are not only popping up, but already in a, you may say, in a full attack in the last half of the 19th century. And Rav Kook is using the life of his father-in-law in order to show the path that he believes in for remedy and a solution. So that's a very interesting small notebook, this Eder Hayakar. In source Aleph, of the sources in front of you, I would also share it in the computer in a second. Share screen. Okay. Yes. So in the first source, that's a quote from this notebook published, this eulogy published by Rav Kook, Eder Hayakar, מאת קורא הדורות, מראש. So it was from the one that is reading the generations, meaning God, the manager of history. הייתה נסיבה, שיהיה, כצלוחית של פוליטון. So he says, my father-in-law was like a tzlochit shel Pleiton, that is a jar of bosem, of perfume, that went throughout all of the world and gave its good smell everywhere. Because we would see he had a very troubled life, but his life took him through many, many places. And he says, אשר תולדתו נקבעה יחד עם תולדות הדור כולו. So his personal history is a reflection of the history of Am Israel in the second half of the 19th century. Again, of course, we don't speak here about Sfarad or the East. We're speaking about Russia. We speak about Eastern Europe. But he sees his father-in-law as life, as a reflection of the life in Eastern Europe. ורשומו ניכר הרבה בעולם העברי. And in the Hebrew word, the marks of my father-in-law, he says, are very apparent. עד אשר כל שנשכיל לדעת מדרכיו ותכונותיו, פעולותיו ומשאת נפשו, the more that we would learn from the paths of the Aderet, his qualities, his actions, the things that he desired, יהיה לנו גם כן עסק כללי ההולך ומשתלב עם יתר חזיונות החיים שבדורנו. It's not only that we would learn about this personal, meaning this private person, but we would also learn about the life of the whole generation. Again, he repeats this claim. And he says, from there we can learn how we should, and it's very interesting, he says, what are the best ways to act with the giants, with the Gdolei Torah, and also what mistakes should we avoid. So he says, if we are looking at his life, we can have what is called hagiography. Just speaking about his praises and all the good things, but then we would miss on some very important points. But if we would see the person, he was a gadol ador, he was a tzaddik, but if we see him in full, as they say in literature, a round character, and not only a flat character, then we would be able to extract much more lessons to how the people that are gdolim should behave. But more important for us, as me, I don't know, maybe some of you are gdolim and just are very humble. But at least for something a simpleton like me, he says that it's also a way to learn how to behave with our Gdolei Torah and how can we encourage them to have more impact on the life of the generation and not in ways marginalize them and limit their effect. Okay, so that's why he sees it as very important to learn about Rabbi Eliyahu David Rabinowitz Teomim. Of course, that is true in a sense to every gadol that we speak about, but maybe it is even more when we speak about Rabbi Eliyahu David Rabinowitz Teomim. Let's begin and see what we can learn in the time that is left. So, בחג השבועות, yes. Oh, let's begin. So, Rav Kook, it's in source bet. בחג השבועות, שנת תר"ב or תר"ג. תר"ב or תר"ג is either 1932 or 1933. So these are the dates that he gives to the birth. Excuse me? 18, of course, 18, of course, excuse me. So 18, either 1840, excuse me, 1842 or 1833. Right? These are the dates of the birth. So it's interesting. He knows it happened on Shavuot because it was famous that he was born on Shavuot. However, they didn't know the exact year that he was born at. And, you know, that is very, very common. I'm sure that some of you do not know the exact year that your parents were born. My grandmother did not know she was born in June. They didn't know the exact birth date. Exactly, because if it was in a Chag or near a Chag, it was very much known, but the year, no one kept track. So they didn't have it. And that happens many times. We know the exact date when important people pass, when they are niftar, when they die. Why? Because then everybody already knew they are chashuv, so they kept records. But when they were born, you do not know if he's important or not. So, and there were no birth certificates, or if even they have been, they were somewhere in Europe, which was Bern or something. So no one really knows. Maybe 1842, maybe 1843. I even saw an opinion that it was in 1845. So that's also a possibility, but it's not really, it doesn't really matter. It's the same time era, and we speak about Shilel. that is a city in Lithuania. So we speak about Litvaks. Litvaks, very strong Litvaks. That's what we should carry in our minds. So they were born as twins. Teomim, exactly. So now you understand the nickname. It seems that there were many twins that were born to this family, and that is the reason why they got the nickname, a part of the family, the last name Rabinowitz, they also got the nickname to the whole family, Teomim. So that is why Teomim, Rabinowitz Teomim. It's not that he Hebraized his name, but that was a nickname they gave him. So they were born as Teomim, Eliyahu, the young, very young Eliyahu David, who was the first of the twins, and the second was a certain Tzvi Yehuda. That is a name that may reappear in our shiur. So Eliyahu David and Tzvi Yehuda, both were born to a Gaon HaChassid, Rabbi Binyamin Zal. So their father was Rabbi Binyamin, who was nicknamed Binyamin HaTzadik, after a famous Talmudic sage that was also nicknamed Binyamin HaTzadik. So they called his father Binyamin HaTzadik. He was an Av Beidin. He was an important Rav in a small city. And what Rav Kook is trying to emphasize is that, and that's the point of most of the Aderet Yakar, that's the point that he's trying to get across. I would just say it in a very short and superficial way. What he says is that when you have two ideologies that contradict, that conflict, then you can see it in two ways. Either you see it as a war of a zero-sum game, and either this side wins or that side wins. Or you can see it as the two forces balancing each other in order to give birth to something that is richer and wider. And Rav Kook says, for 200 years almost, Chassidut and Mitnagdut, for the lack of a better name, I mean, the Litvish, right? And you may say the Ukrainian and the Polish and the Russian, all of the very eastern side part of Europe, which was caught very much into Hasidism. So that was one force. And then you had Lithuania, with, of course, the Gaon Mivilna, and then all of his descendants, and it's mostly students. And these were the Mitnagdim, right? Those that opposed Hasidut. But Mitnagdim is a very bad name. I mean, they were very bad at branding. I think I already spoke about that when we spoke about the 18th century, because that only put you as a negative. So no one would want to be remembered as only negative to something. So we may call it Torah Judaism, right? Or something like that. Now, Hasidism put a lot of emphasis on the spirit, on midot, right? On personal traits, on holiness, and mitnagdut, like this Torah Judaism, put a lot of emphasis on learning Torah. And you can see these two ideologies as combating each other, which they did for a lot of time. But Rav Kook claims that during these wars, what was born was a third option, in which both sides enriched each other. So because there was Hasidism, then the Mitnagdim, the Litvaks, couldn't be just ice-cold Torah learners without any spirituality or emotions. They had also to develop the side of emotions and midot and personal traits. Why? Because otherwise everyone would go to Hasidism. And on the other side, Hasidism was not, the danger of Hasidism was that they would only focus on emotions and holiness and spiritualness, and halacha and Torah would be abandoned. But because the Mitnagdim always kept them in check, then they had to be strict adherents also to halacha and Torah. So in the end, something shared was born out of them. And Rav Kook says that the Aderet's father already, and most importantly, the Aderet himself, was a model for this combination of Litvak and the Chassid in the same person, someone that is very much into Torah, and his life was Torah learning, but also he was very developed in his emotional side, in his personal traits. So that's the claim that Rav Kook is advancing for the book. And then he says, and that synthesis, right, should be carried not only to Hasidism and the Mitnagdim, but also to Zionism and anti-Zionism, also to enlightenment and anti-enlightenment. All of these ideologies, instead of entrenching ourselves into some war with each other, we should try to look from above and see how can we contribute to each other. So that is the idea that he was trying to advance. And now it doesn't mean that we cannot pick a side. We are allowed to see ourselves as Hasidim or as Mitnagdim, but instead of fighting the other side, let's see what strength does he have and how we can learn and embody some of the lessons that he can teach us. That is a very lofty idea. We would hope that just writing a book would help every one of us to incorporate such a view into our life, and that our politic body would be just like that every party would have his own ideology, but also see how the other is contributing. Well, it seems that we have a few more steps to go into this direction. Anyhow, that is as a background to the environment that David Eliyahu was born into. However, there is also here a very strong personal, psychological, we may say, side, a part of the great ideologies of Hasidut and Mitnagdim, and how do you combine them? And that is now, I would quote from, as I said, the diary that we have of the Aderet of Eliyahu David Rabinowitz Teomim, and in which we find, I could just have the whole show here just reading from you his personal diary, because it is amazing. He's writing very exposed, very, very open. I think in ways that only very humble people can write about themselves, because otherwise you would feel prideful. But if you're so humble that you have you're taking no pride in anything, then you are able to write about yourself in this manner. Amazing, amazing book. So I would read we can only read a few lines, obviously. So let's begin in source Gimel, from his diary. And he writes the following about his childhood. אדוני אבי זקני רבי שלמה ז"ל, ואחיו הרב רבי אברהם יצחק. So he says, my grandfather and his brother and one of his children, meaning one of my uncles, Hirleib, that was still young. And my mother, he says, וגם אמי מורתי ז"ל, כולם עזבו את ארץ החיים בירח אחד. They all died at 1 month. In the year of Tafreishchet, in Berks, I put the English date, 1848, במחלת החולרה, רחמנא ליצלן. So that is cholera, that's right. 1848. So it was either 4 or 5 or 3, depends on what you take as his birth date. Now he doesn't remember the year that he was born in. He does remember the year that his mother passed away. ונשארנו כולנו יתומים. We all remained orphans. He has his own twin brother. He also had 2 sisters. So we remained orphans. עזובים, abandoned. דלים וראשיים, also poor. אשר זאת גרם הרבה סיבות וגלגולים בכל תולדותיו. This event is a main key to everything that happened afterwards. So it's not me reading some Freudian context into his diary. He says the death of my mother was crucial to understand my life afterwards. He was extremely sensitive person. I think, obviously that was also his nature. I think that is clear, that he was very sensitive. But we can only, I think, surmise that the death of his mother in such a young age caused him to be much more sensitive to other people's troubles. And he was, can you say, a crier? Someone that cries all the time. He was crying, and he described it in his diary. He would cry every Pesach when they would come to בכל דור ודור עומדים עלינו לכלותנו, that in every generation they want to destroy us, and the Kadosh Baruch Hu is saving us from them. So he says, I begin to cry every year to extent that I am shamed in front of my children, that I cannot control myself. So a few stories here from his childhood. He says, בשנת פטירת אמי הורתי זצ"ל, when my mother passed away, עוד לא יכולנו להגיד קדיש כראוי, לפי צעירת ימינו. We could still not say even the Kaddish. So it doesn't make sense that he was born in 1842, because that would make him 6. at the age of 6, children are being taught, it's chas v'chayil to see that, but we did see it sometime. Children can be taught at the age of 6 to say the Kaddish. So I would say that that in itself is alone to push the birth date at least to 44, and then it would make sense. At the age of 4, the age of 3, he was not able to say the Kaddish. פעם אחת, he says, once, בכיתי באמצע קריאת המגילה בתחילת סימן ד'. So at the beginning of the 4th chapter of מגילת אסתר, I began to cry. ובשובי לבית, so he was still very, very young, and when they returned home, הפציר בי הבמרי זצ"ל, למה בכי? So his father asked him, why did you cry in the middle? Usually in מגילת אסתר, we know, children are, they are happy there. So why did you cry? ולא רציתי להגיד, I didn't want to say, עד שגזר עליי, he had to command me, להגיד את האמת, and I said the truth, כי ליבי דאבה מהתלאות שמצאו למרדכי הצדיק שלבש שק ואפר. So they were so sad for Mordechai, who had to sit with the sack and the ashes. So that's such a sensitive soul. She's someone that is suffering and can recognize the suffering of the other, even in a story from 2,000 years old, 1,500 years old, no more, 2,500 years old, he still sees the suffering coming through it, and he's crying in the middle of Megillat Esther. And he says, I skip, but in the diaries, he describes his bar mitzvah. So his bar mitzvah was in Shavuot, as you can imagine, because he was born on Shavuot. He says, a few days before Shavuot, my father called us the twins, right? Him and his twin brother, Tzvi Yehuda, and he spoke with us about our responsibility. Now, speaking about responsibility is something that we do with every bar mitzvah, but you know, he is a very special father. His father was the Rav of the city, and he himself was a very special child. So his father spoke, at the age of 13, his father spoke with him about the importance of not losing any minute and using every second of time in order to learn Torah. So he says, this speech went into me and I carry it to this very day, about the importance of using time. And then he says, when Shavuot came, and on Leil Shavuot, my father asked me to do the zimun, to lead the benching. Now you have to remember, they were twin brothers and the father. So up till then, they didn't have a zimun. And then with one bar mitzvah, they suddenly had 3 men. So his father asked him to lead the zimun, and he began to cry. From I don't know even from what exactly, but I guess from the התרגשות, right? From the emotions that came into it. So he began to cry. He says, it took me a long time till I was able to control myself, and we were able to say the zimun and the benching on this Shavuot. Now, as I said, he was a giant, a genius, and he began to write his chidushim at a very young age. Now, again, a beautiful story from his diary in source Dalid. It's the second side of the page. No, it's not. No, you have it here. Okay, but I had for some reason to skip the side. כבר בהיותי בן 12, he says, already when I was 12, החל לפעם בליבי החשק לכתוב חידושי תורה. I began to be conquered by this desire to write חידושי תורה. ותשוקתי הייתה מאוד לחדש. I just wanted to write new things, אך לא ידעתי איזה דרך אשכון אור. I was a young child, and I didn't know what path is the light is in. I didn't know in what ways to write. ופעם אחת ראיתי בסידור תיקוני שבת גודל המעלה שמחדשים בשבת, ששואלים לנשמה יתירה, אם חידשה או שמע חידוש בתורה. So he says, once I learned in a siddur, I saw in some siddur that they said that we have an extra neshama. We are being taught by the Mekubalim that on Shabbat we have an extra soul coming for us only for Shabbat. And the Torah you learn on Shabbat, when Motzei Shabbat, when this neshama goes up back to heaven, it's being asked, what chidushei Torah did you do on Shabbat? Because the rest of the week, this neshama cannot have any chidushei Torah, only on Shabbat. So he said, when I saw that, I understood that I need to learn my new chidushim, my new Torah on Shabbat. And he began to write it on Motzei Shabbat, and he called it Nishmat Shabbat, the soul of Shabbat. So he would learn a chidush on the Parsha or something else every Shabbat, and you'd write it on Motzei Shabbat on this small notebook. And then he began another notebook for the weekdays. And he says, an amazing story. Now, he was very humble, and that would, again, come again and again. He was extremely humble. He didn't want anyone to know that he's writing this chidushi. So he wanted to hide it in his coat. However, he was worried that his father, when he's cleaning the coat, would find it in the, I guess, in the pocket. So he ripped the pocket and he created like a secret pocket within the pocket in which he put the notebook. However, one day he says, I did something that I knew that my father is going to punish me for. Now, he doesn't say what. But he says, I was playing as a child and I did something that I knew that I deserved punishing. But I was worried that when my father would punish me, he would be able to feel, I guess that he speaks about spanking, and he would be able to feel the notebook in my coat. So I was so worried that he would find the notebook that I threw it into the fire. And it says in Berks, he says in a note, he says, I was very young and didn't know it is forbidden to burn Chidushei Torah. Now, he was about to be punished by his father. If I was him and I had a note by I didn't have a notebook of Chidushei Torah at the age of 12. But if let's imagine that I would have had one, I would go with that to my father and ask him to spare me the punishment. But he was so worried about being caught that he preferred throwing to the fire all of his chidushim that I guess he worked so hard on them and be punished without his father finding out his chidushim. It's an amazing story. Another story, which I didn't quote here, but it can be found in his diary, is that in the age of 13, so that's his story from 12, 13. At the age of 13, 14, he was being meshudach. He says, as the minhag back then was, without asking me. So he writes that, without asking me. And he was being meshudach, matched with a girl from the next town, and he says it was great. I was not asked, but it was great. And the father-in-law, the prospective father-in-law, promised that I would be able to be fed there for 6 years after my marriage, and he would give me a nice nedunya, and everything would be great. And then he said something amazing. He says, my father dropped me in this next village, and they decided that the marriage would take effect 3 years from now. So at the age of 13 or 14, he was engaged, we may say. And the plan was that 3 years, everyone would make the necessary preparations. And then at the age of 16, 17, they would be at the ripe age, I guess, they would be married. So his father put him in this next village and drove back home for a few days or weeks or months, it's unclear. And he says, I would meet every day with my, again, he doesn't say fiancé, but with the meshudechet. And he says, we would sit to speak for long hours as the minhag, as the custom of Bnei Neurim, of the youth. And he says, but don't worry, we never did anything that is improper, which I mean, that's amazing. But again, amazing that he is exposing that. So he says, we sat and we spoke, and she so loved my Chidushei Torah. I'm not sure that she was, I don't know who the girl was, but it's an amazing thought that he would sit with her and speak with her about his Chidushei Torah. He says she took great pride in me writing my Chidushim, and he says she was learning secular knowledge, but she didn't force me. Again, she was 12 years old, but he says, but she never said that she would force me also to learn secular knowledge. Obviously, they both fell in love with each other. It's a beautiful story. However, it's a tragic story because so he was there for some days, again, I know a few weeks or a few months, and then his father came and took him back home, and everything seems very good. What they didn't know is that after he was taken back home, his prospective mother-in-law passed away, was niftar, and the father of the meshudechet took a new wife. Now, this new wife, that was a complicated story. Some of it was censored out, but that is in the best of tradition of stepmothers, I guess. She didn't want her stepdaughter to be married to such a chashuv family because she had a son from her first marriage, and he didn't have such a a wonderful shidduch. So the end result is that she worked actively in order to destroy the shidduch. Also, she seems to be a much, again, the family, we can already hear that the daughter was learning secular knowledge. So it was a more liberal, we'd call today, home. And it seems that the new wife was much more liberal. And the end result was of all of these occurrences that his father decided to cancel the shidduch. Now you have to understand, in their days, most of the time it was preferred to get married and to give the get, to get the divorce a day later. The canceling a shidduch was considered something that just is never to be done. And for a Rav to cancel a shidduch, that was out of the question. But I would guess that the prospective mother-in-law the situation was so terrible that they just had no other choice. They canceled the shidduch again without asking him. And he was devastated. He was devastated because he really loved the girl. And the whole thing is written very openly. Amazing story. And again, he says, he was depressed for a year because his heart was broken. Again, you can imagine it's a 14 or 15 years old boy who fell in love with a girl and thought that he's getting married with her, and they were separated not out of his will and not out of her will, but because of the general atmosphere. And that was, for him, it was devastating. However, he was again being meshudach by his father 2 years later, again without asking him. That's just how it was. I have a few stories in my family dating 2 generations ago in Romania, which in Romania, in the same manner, people were being meshudach without asking them, and that's just how life goes. No one thought to complain. Maybe they complained to each other. One generation, yeah. That's how life were being lived. That's just how it was. And it's again, and he was married. She was his wife to the rest of his life. But yet in his diary, he writes that in the beginning, he was very disappointed because he was not able to create the same connection that he had with the first girl. And he says she didn't want to speak with me. She was not interested in my chidushim. So it was very difficult for him. And but in the end, the marriage took place, and obviously they had very good marriage life afterwards. But it's interesting to see how such a giant is still have to deal with all things that some of us are having to go through, or at least to instruct our children when they are going through, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so he's getting married. However, he is extremely poor. His father was not rich. He was a Rav of the city. He was not rich. And his father-in-law, now the real father-in-law, was supposed to be rich when the shidduch was made. And he again promised that he was eat by his table, and that later he would give him a very large sum of money to open his own business, and everything would be beautiful. However, there was a revolt of the Polans against the Russians in 1863 and 1864. And in this revolt, as a consequence of this revolt, his father-in-law lost all of his money. And not only that he was not able to give him what he promised, the end was that he asked his new son-in-law for a loan. And Rabbi Eliyahu was always he was very generous. That was just, again, the type of person, the soul that he was. So he gave a loan to his father-in-law. And the father-in-law, some of this loan he gave back to him as the gift that he promised him. And Rabinowitz writes, I already made 7 prusbuls. You made a prusbul every Shemitah year in order for the loan not to be dropped. So 5 prusbuls is 35 years. He says, he writes it 35 years later. He says, I already wrote 5 prusbuls, and I give myself a blessing that I should write many more prusbuls on it. Because getting back the money, says there is no way, so at least I should live long and write many more prusbus for this loan. So again, an amazing story. Now, he doesn't have any money. His father-in-law cannot give him anything. So he says, I must get a shtal, right? I must get a position, a rabbi position, and begin to have some parnasa. So he goes to Ponovich. Ponovich was a big Jewish, important Jewish city. I mean, we know today the yeshiva. But the yeshiva is coming from a certain city in Lithuania, a very important city from a Jewish point of view. I have no idea if it's a very important from a Goyish point of view, but from a Jewish point of view, it's a very important city, and a strong Balibatim, and it was supposed to be a very comfortable position from the economic side of things. And also very important from the ability to teach Torah, etc. So he became the rabbi of Ponovich. However, nothing was simple. On the spiritual level, Ponovich was beginning to be inflicted, or continuing to be inflicted, by the type of a Haskalah movement that was prevalent in Lithuania of the time, which was not your orthodox Haskalah that you can find in some places, but it was a very sharp atheism, and the new atheism of the time. It's always new. So now we have new atheism, and they had also new atheism. Very, very sharp, very strong. And he was, to be direct, I think he was not equipped to deal. I mean, he had no secular studies. And here are some of his sefarim, which are beautiful. They are very scholarly from the Torah point of view, but it's very difficult to find in them anything that is of what we call today secular or general knowledge. That was not the type of person he was. He was 22 hours a day into Torah. And I think he was not equipped to deal with, as many other rabbis, but it was not special in any way. That was part of the problem that happened. He was not equipped to deal with the maskilim on their own field, answering their critiques. What he was able to do, and that Rav Kook writes very interestingly, he says he was how do you say, a migdalo, tower of light, a lighthouse. He was a lighthouse of Musa, of morals. And when people saw him, they said, I want my son to be like him. And Rav Kook is developing that to a whole theory, saying that, and Rav Kook said, we need to learn secular knowledge, we need to be able to answer in the scientific language, we need all of that. But Rav Kook says, you should know that the real gains are not to be achieved through writing a sefer in which you are disproving or reproving Torah and Hashkafa, or disproving and dissing science. That's not the way to go. The real way to go is, if we will be models of morals, people would look at us, and in our communities, would look at us as what we call today datiim. That was not a word that was used back then, but as observant people, and would say, I would like my children to learn in such a school, because I would like him to have these midot, regardless right now if you believe the Torah was given at Sinai or not. If we would be able to do that, then we can manage with any scientific proof that would be thrown at us. However, if people would look at the Dati community and they would say, Chas v'shalom, that my child would look like that, then as best as we would be in writing scientific books, proving our beliefs, no one would want to come near us. And Rav Kook says that's what we should work on, and that is improving our stature as moral people. I think that's a very important lesson that he draws from the life of his father-in-law. Again, I think that it should be said, it is not necessarily enough, but it is a prerequisite. If we want to continue, our children should look, others, but even before others, our own children should look at us and say, I want to continue the ways of my father. I want to continue the ways of my mother. If they look at us and say, these are people that these are not the people that I want to look like, I would want to look like the professor in my university, then that's how they would be. So that's a very important lesson that Rav Kook is drawing from the life of the spiritual side of the Aderet in Ponovitch. But also he had many problems from not only the spiritual side, but also what we can see as the economical side, the physical side of things. He was not paid well, and sometimes he was not paid at all. And he became extremely poor. Now, he was not, again, his type of personality, he stood up on things that were spiritually important for him, and it was very much against his nature, but he felt that he must do it for the honor of God. But everything that relates to him, he was just not able to stand and demand that they would pay him properly or just pay him at all. And sometimes he went for months without being paid. His family became extremely poor, extremely poor. Other rabbis tried to interfere for his behalf against the people, the Rashei Haida, right, the heads of the community of Ponovitch, but they were not successful. And there was a fire, and the small house they were living in was burned down. And then someone took him in, and the heads of the community were so happy that someone took him in that they never repaid him for building back the house. That was how bad things were. And again, he was not able to stand against them. They were balei batim, they were very strong people, and he was just not. He was a easy prey for them, I think. And his life became very difficult because of that. He had, his wife gave birth, I think I read 10 or 12 children. Only 4 survived after him. And he lost 2 daughters immediately. His first 2 daughters were both passed before they reached the age of 2. And then another son before he reached the age of 4. And again, he was so sensitive, and he writes in the diary, every time it happened, he was devastated, and we can only imagine. We can only imagine. And I think the most heartbreaking story is a son. He called the son after his father, Binyamin, after his father passed away. He called the son after him. And this son passed at the age of 2.5. And then another son was born, and he called him Azriel Binyamin. So he gave him as a second name, the name of his father. This child, he grew up. And then at the age, and he was extremely smart, very gifted. He knew the Chayei Adam, which was like the Kitzur for the Litvaks, right? So he knew it by heart. And he says that in some Yiddish halacha books and the Siddur at the age of 8. And then at the age of 8, he got some disease in his feet. Now, we cannot know from what is written in the diary what the nature of the disease was, but he couldn't walk. And he ran throughout all the doctors. But you know what the doctors in Lithuania of the time knew? Nothing. They were nothing. And no one could help him. And he says on Sukkot, he brought him to the sukkah. He carried him on his arms. And the child was so happy with going to the sukkah and being able to be Mekayim in the midst of sukkah. And he says, I was sitting there and crying, and I was not able to make the bracha on the sukkah. And then after Simchat Torah, the situation of the child was really deteriorating, and it seems the disease was somehow expanding from the feet. Again, I don't know what it was. Maybe some poisonous of the blood, maybe something else, maybe it was cancer. Who knows? And it was advancing from the feet, and he began to feel bad also in his stomach and then in the head. And then the child lost his ability to think and speak in coherent way. And he was just mumbling Divrei Torah. A child in the age of 8, and his father is destroyed, and then the child passed away. And then the Aderet writes in his diary, after he lost 2 children that were named after his father, he says, maybe it is because I didn't make a proper kibud horim. And that's so now you read that, you see he's struggling, he's trying to find the meaning. And I'm sure that he had the best kibud horim that any one of us can even imagine. And what we can say? What can we say? So this is a very, very, very difficult life. Very difficult life. And After, it is clear, by the way, that some of the deaths were preventable if he would have paid properly and were able to heat his house, for example. A very simple thing in Ponovich in the winter. He had a daughter that clearly died because the house was not, he writes that, because the house was not heated. And the reason why the house was not heated is because they didn't pay properly. That's it's very sad and very difficult to hear, but that's how life were. And by the way, when he asked to be paid, again, he came to them and asked that they would increase his salary. They said that he's, and he writes that, say you are a murderer because every penny we pay you, every ruble we pay you is coming from the kupa of the community, and that is instead of building the hospital and giving to sick people, you are asking, your rabbi is asking for more money. So after he heard that, he was not able. Again, they played him. They knew how to play him, and he was not able to stand and say, my children are also important. One of the Rabbanim convinced him, after he was not paid for a few months at a certain point in time, then one of the Rabbanim in the area was able to convince him to go on a strike. So he didn't answer halachic questions for a few months, but he says that it seems that the people of the city were not impressed. Now, the time is beginning to become shorter. He had, as I said, he had 3 children that did survive, and one of them was a daughter that he married to Rav Avram Yitzchak Cohen Cook. Unfortunately, she also died in a young age while he was still alive. And then he convinced Rav Avram Yitzchak Cohen Cook, that remained very, very much connected to him, as you can see, to marry the daughter of his twin brother, Tzvi Yehuda. So Rav Avram Yitzchak Cohen Cook married his daughter, and then his niece, then his niece, thank you. And then his niece, the daughter of his twin brother. The son of Rav Cook, that would be called Tzvi Yehuda Cook, would be after this brother of his first father-in-law. That's an interesting story by itself. So he remained in Ponovich. He was writing all the time. He wrote more than 120 books. But he was so humble that only a handful of them was printed while he was still alive. One of them he printed after he came to Yerushalayim, they would say in a minute, he printed, but he didn't want his name on it. On the other hand, nothing could be printed from Yerushalayim without his askama, because he was the assistant rabbi of Yerushalayim. So he had to give askama to his own sefer. So that's one of the rare cases, I don't know if there is any other case, in which you have askama on a sefer written by the author himself. Obviously, and in the askama, this provision, he is arguing with himself. So he says that what was written in the book is not right, as you can imagine. So again, a beautiful story. Now, he was in Ponovich for I think 13 years, and then he moved to Mir, another very important city. Back then, it was less important than Ponovich. So he downgraded himself because he had no other choice. Now, as you can imagine, when he signed the contract with Mir, then the people of Ponovich woke up and they bought a whole new apartment for him, and they offered him 4 times the salary that he was paid up till then. And he thought maybe to cancel the new contract with Mir and return to Ponovich, but he says, no, if I gave my word, then I have to go to Mir. And he left Ponovich. They tried to prevent it. They stopped the movers from taking it. It was a long story. But in the end, he was able to escape. He went to Mir. Now, he really hoped that they would let him teach in the yeshiva in Mir. That's what he didn't so much was after the rabbanut of the city. He really hoped that he would be able to teach in the Mir yeshiva, which was already known. However, that didn't work out for different reasons. So after 7 years in Mir, when he received an offer to come as the assistant rabbi in Yerushalayim, the rabbi of Yerushalayim was Rabbi Shmuel Salant. He was the rabbi of Yerushalayim for 65 years. He was very old, and they looked for an assistant rabbi that would first serve as an assistant rabbi, and then everyone assumed that he would pass away, b'seiva tova, and the assistant rabbi would be able to take his place. So he took the position, and he came to Yerushalayim, and they greatly respected him. and he also, because he was now the assistant rabbi in Yerushalayim, he was also able to pave the way for his former son-in-law, Rabbi Yitzchak Cohen Kook, to become the Rav of Yafo. And that's how Rav Kook became the Rav of Yafo. Again, a very interesting story. He felt in debt to him because he was not able to provide him, as was used, that the minhag was the father-in-law would provide the son-in-law, but he was so poor that when Rav Kook took his daughter, he was not able to provide. So all the time he felt bad. I guess that he remembered how his father-in-law was able to provide for him. So when he was able to help Rav Kook to get a position in Yafo, he was very happy to do so. And of course, Rav Kook was very much appropriate for the position. So he was very happy to do so. So he was central in the bringing of Rav Kook to Eretz Israel. Again, very, very interesting. However, as tragic as this whole story is, in the end, Rav Shmuel Salant lived longer than he did. He came to Yerushalayim, but after, Rav Shmuel Salant was already close to 100 years old, and Rav Rabinowitz was hardly 60. But he came to Yerushalayim, and something didn't work. Maybe it was, they say, Rav Kook says in his Sefer, that because he had a window, they wanted him to have a nice apartment. What is a nice apartment? An apartment with a window to Harabait, to the Temple Mount. However, every morning he woke up and saw the destruction of the Harabait. And again, he was such a sensitive soul and such a high spiritual level that it killed him to see it every morning. That's what Rav Kook writes. And again, it's so many troubles, and his life was not simple. His twin brother died at a young age. Yehuda died in a young age. So he had a very, very troubled life. And Yerushalayim was very complicated because you had the Ishuv Hayashan and you had the Ishuv Hachadash, and he was trying to be uniting everyone, but they didn't want it to be united. And so he made a few important things. He made an Eruv. He was the first one to install an Eruv for the new neighborhoods that were outside of the city walls. That was a very important step to incorporate these new neighborhoods into the old city. So he made the Eruv. He made a takana for supervisors to go in the markets and make sure that the weights are proper, that no one is lying. So, but only 5 years, and in the end, he was always under the Rav Shmuel Salant. So he was not able to make his own policies. And then he was niftar in Gimel Adar. That is, last week was his Yortzeit at Taf Reish Samechei, which is 1905. 1905. So around the age of 60 or 62 or 63, again, depending on when do you pen his birth date. So he passed away, and the doctors came and they were trying to revive him. They had some type of zrika, of an injection. I don't know what exactly they injected to him, but it was able to revive him for a minute. That was at night. So he woke up with a start, and he said the parshiot of tefillin. Why? Because he was not able to put the tefillin. He supposed that he would not live for the next morning. So he said the parshiot of tefillin. He was very much into the mitzvah of tefillin. He would walk with tefillin almost the whole day. It was very important for him. And I think that it is because, he says it in the diary, that his father gave him to put on tefillin a year before of his bar mitzvah, because he was such a sensitive and wonderful child. And that was, for him, it was very empowering. So he would continue to put tefillin almost throughout the whole day, and he had a few pairs of tefillin that he would change, because maybe one of them is pasul. But he had an attraction, you may say, to the mitzvah. He was very careful with the mitzvah of tefillin, so he said the parshiyot of tefillin at night, and then he passed away. And the book says it is sorrowful that the people of Yerushalayim were not able to know him good enough to let him really present his ideas and run the place. However, Rav Kook himself saw himself in many ways as continuing the legacy of his father-in-law, and in that way you may say that he was he had a very key role in influencing Rav Kook, which is one of the greatest thinkers of Yahadut in the last generation. So that's a very important historical role, you may say. Now, his Sefarim, some of them are now being printed. There is a whole institution, a whole Musad now that is dedicated to printing his books, his Sefarim. You see here 3 of them. This is from the library of the yeshiva. There are many more. So one is as this diary, and also there is a wheel here. A very, very interesting Sefer. If you can get a hold of it and read it, I think that is an amazing, amazing read. That is on the Parsha. Now that is only for Chumash Shmot. So you can see there's 5 volumes. Very, very rich. Now it is very scholarly. It is not an easy read, and he is not after drashot. He discusses things from the halachic side. That's what he's interested in. Pilpul. And for the lovers of the genre, that is beautiful. For those of you that are less attracted, then it's a difficult read. This third sefer that I have, again, it's 3 out of 120. So it's a very, very small, it's a very small mitgam. It's a very small, I don't know, example. An example. Yes, example. So this is a responsa that for questions that he was asked. Again, very, very interesting question. We don't have the time here. My time is up. But here's a question. For example, here's a question about the extent to which someone that is in suffering is required to learn Torah. A very long answer. Again, but very scholarly. Not an easy read. It will take us an hour to analyze the answer. But very, very interesting. And there is a question. He got questions, by the way, from North America. Because he was a great giant of Torah, so questions were asked from all over the world, and maybe it was because he was in Yerushalayim, so they saw Yerushalayim as the headquarters of Torah, so they sent him a question. They had in some place in I think he doesn't write the exact place, but they had a place in which the shochet was not acting properly. By the way, that was a problem relevant everywhere, but in North America especially, and they asked him if they can eat from his shechita, etc., etc., etc. Now he tended to be machmir on this type of situations. Again, I mean, that, of course, that is a very superficial statement. So you'd excuse me for saying that. But he was a real tzaddik in all heart and soul. So that, again, very interesting read for the lovers of the genre. And then, yes, many, many contrasts into small notebooks. He wrote about everything more or less in Torah. So again, a very interesting personality, also a very sad one in many aspects, that gave us a window into his soul by the diary that he wrote, which I think is beautiful, and enabling us to understand better our Gdolei Torah and the challenges they had to overcome, the way they did overcome them. I think, again, amazing to see how can you develop after suffering so much blows in the young age, and it is for me very, very much inspiring, and also, as Rav Kook, I think, very correctly wrote, a window into a whole generation, what they went through, and the paths that he tried to pave forward, which were taken by his great son-in-law, Rav Kook himself, about which I guess we'd have to dedicate shiurim, Be'ezrat Hashem, later in this year, or maybe next year, when we would reach him. So thank you very much. And maybe Be'ezrat Hashem, we would meet next week.
This was, you said he kind of quite a classical here. You say that was, say, I think it sounds like it was quite the Flatfish rather than.
Rav Kook himself saw, it's a very